So I want to welcome everybody to Psalm 70. After two long Psalms, it feels like a chance to breathe out with a short Psalm. And even before I describe it, I want to read it because, there's a lot to be said about this little Psalm. But I thought it'd be important to first read Psalm 70. And again, I delight in the odometer now moving with that left number up to 7 as we move forward in our study of Psalms. This one, I took a phrase, let them turn on their heels in shame. For the conductor, for David, for remembrance. God, to save me, Adonai, to help me, make haste. Let them be ashamed and abashed that seek my spirit. Let them be turned backward and brought to confusion that delight in my hurt. Let them turn on their heels in shame, those who say, hooray, hooray. Let all those be glad and happy in you, all who seek you, and let them say continually, God is great, lovers of your deliverance. But as for me, I am poor and needy. God, hasten to me. My help and my Redeemer are you. Adonai, do not delay. So some analysis. Do not delay, make haste is the frame of this psalm, with that same theme repeated as well in the middle of the psalm. In verse 6, hasten to me. So hasten, husha, repeated, and for emphasis, al ta'achar, do not delay. There is something about this psalm that conveys urgency, clearly with that as the theme. The King James Version entitles this song, Make Haste, O God, to Deliver Me. And the conciseness of the psalm conveys that quality of urgency. Now, these lines we've seen before, almost exactly the same, but not quite the same, when we studied Psalm 40. There, verses 14 to 18, was this psalm. And there's a difference of opinion which and how it came about, that they're different, that you get the same words with some subtle changes in the two. I shared with you that Robert Alter, that wonderful professor of literature at Berkeley who's done a translation of Tanakh, in his commentary to this psalm, says that he believes 70 came first, is very early, and he points to a word change, namely verse 4, one second. Yeah, verse 4 here reads, Yashuvu al Ekev, let them turn on their heels. And in verse 16 of Psalm 40, it's Yasomu al Ekev, which is let them be appalled, and their Akev is on account of or following their shame. And he says that in context, Yashuvu, returns, makes more sense. But there's another reason to suggest that 40 came after 70. As I compared the two Psalms, there's more, they are very similar, but there are different added words in 40, and the addition seems to be accretion. something that's added later than the more distilled version of Psalm 70. One preacher that I saw as I scanned for commentaries to Psalm 70 said that he thought that Psalm 40 came first and then Psalm 70. That's these overlay of verses was like pulling out the chorus in terms of these 5 verses. And that's an opinion. And for the rabbis, there's another opinion, and that is, the rabbis classically look for what's the moment that evoked this psalm. The early medieval commentators, like Radak and Meiri, they said that 40 and 70 were written by King David on the run. His 2 major foes in his life was King Saul in his youth and Absalom, his son, seeking the kingship in his last years. And they'd say they don't know which one. It's not until the 19th century when the Malbim, Meir Lebush ben Yechiel Michael Wisser, who was a prodigy who from Volnia, later became the rabbi of Bucharest, was offered to become the chief rabbi of New York City, but turned it down, stayed in Eastern Europe. He wrote a commentary, and he would say that Psalm 40 was written by a King David on the run from King Saul, and Psalm 70 is an elderly David on the run from his son. And as evidence, he points out that Psalm 71 in 2 places, verses 9 and 19, which we'll study on Tuesday, that Psalm 71 makes reference to an elderly King David and more. The key change between 40 and 70 are the names for God, so that in verse 40, God's name is YHVH, that name of a compassionate God. And in verse 70, there's more of a use of God's name as Elohim, the God of judgment. And so the commentators will say regarding verse 70, that is a God judging David after the scandal of Bathsheva. And so in Psalm 40, it's the merciful God, it's a young David. Verse 70, it's more complicated. Though we'll see there's a back and forth. Well, let's see right now. You see in verse 2, there's Elohim, God, and there is Adonai, YHVH. And they would say, God, judge me, save me. Adonai, help me. So that there's a sense of a plea. In some, we don't know which of the 2 came first, 40 or 70. In some, we don't know when this psalm was written. But there's some interesting poetic devices used in this psalm. First, again, because it's shorter, I can point out little things. For remembrance, lahaskir, in the opening, is only used in one other psalm. That's in Psalm 38. It's not clear what it means. Robert Alter translates it as to call to mind. Adine Steinsaltz translates it as for God to remember. There's some sense of evoking God's presence or God's memory. Why only in this psalm? Psalm 38 dealt with David in great physical strain and illness, and that's the other place. What they have in common, Psalm 70 and 38, is distress. Of course, that's not uncommon in Psalms. Verse 3, let them be ashamed and abashed. There's an expression in Yiddish when they want to say it's a shanda and a cherpa. I don't know if you know that Yiddish expression, a shanda and a cherpa. The shanda is an embarrassment, and the cherpa is related to the word here, yachperu. They should be abashed. Another word for ashamed. Mevakshe nafshi, those who seek out my spirit. And again, we don't know who these enemies are and why they're pursuing this speaker. And here we get that word yasugu achor, let them be turned back or backward. V'yikalmu, brought to confusion, chafetze ra'ati, who seek my evil, who seek my hurt. And here's the first thing to point out, and that is there are 3 words that get repeated and used in different ways. So in verse 3, there is this word achor, go back, right? Let them be turned backward. And that's in reference to one's enemies. In verse 6, the last word, the same root of going backwards, is don't go backwards, which means do not delay. And here it's in reference to God. So the same word, there'll be 3 such words in this short psalm that are kind of used with the same root. One to refer to the enemy, the same word used to refer to God. Here's another example. Verse 4. Let them turn on their heels in shame, those who say, hooray, hooray. Now, those who say, ha'omrim, is matched in the next word with v'yomru tamid. The faithful, they say continually, God is great. So say in verses 4 and 5, the same word, are flipped. It's a contrast between what one's enemies say and what the righteous say. And there's a third, just to emphasize that this is one of the poetic devices, and that's the word to seek. Here in verse 3, those who seek my spirit. So this is a description of enemies. They seek my spirit. And in verse 6, the same word of verse 5, those who seek, all who seek you, God. So again, that's a description of the righteous. So in this very short psalm, these 5 verses, you have 3 examples of the same word used to describe the bad guys and the good guys. I always like to count out. I don't know if this is the intention of the Psalter, but it's something that, as you've seen, it's kind of been a habit of mine to count out what's the middle word of a psalm, as if that's the bullseye. In this case, remarkably, it comes in verse 5, because verse 6 is long and verse 5 is long, and that makes let all those be glad, yasisu, becomes the middle word of this psalm, which again is an interesting contrast. This is a psalm of feeling urgency. God, make haste to save me in order that I shall be glad. The middle word, the bullseye, the goal of this psalm is to rejoice. The middle word, yasisu. There are two phrases here that are not only in quotation marks, but that come with exclamation marks, at least as I punctuate it. So verse 4, let them turn on their heels in shame. By the way, there too there's ambiguity. It can be understood in 3 different ways. The phrase of may they return on their heels can be translated as may they retrace their steps in shame, meaning, may they go back from where they come. It can also be turn on one's heels, means, which is kind of like it because it's our colloquial, to turn on their heels means to suddenly turn, right? You turn on their heels, and may they do so in shame. And the third way to understand that opening phrase of verse 4 is may they turn back because of their shame. So here, those people who should be ashamed of themselves, that's verse 3 and 4. Whoever is this person tormenting the speaker, he says, and we don't know why, they should be ashamed of themselves. That's the word that gets repeated in 3 and in 4. And then this characterizes them. Who are those people that should be ashamed of themselves? They say, ha'ach, ha'ach. We've seen that word before, ha'ach. And I just pause to talk about ha'ach, ha'ach. 1 second. It appears 12 times, this phrase, ha'ach. The word ha'ach appears 12 times in Tanakh. It appears once in Isaiah, 3 times in Ezekiel. We saw it twice in Psalm 35. It's also verse 16 of Psalm 40 and here, and once in Job. And so for me, the question was how to translate ha'ach, ha'ach. Clearly, it's an expression. And I found a lot of different ways that it got translated. So Martin Cohen translated it as hurrah, hurrah. The King James Version, Art Scroll, Richard Levy, the more common translation is aha, aha. When I translated previously Psalm 40, I translated as ha, ha, as words of derision, ha, ha. But Steinsaltz, which is a more recent translation, translates it as hooray, hooray. And I stayed with hooray, hooray. Here's why. In looking at the other ways it's used, as in Ezekiel, it's used as an expression of celebration of the foe. So in Ezekiel, the foe is celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem and says ha'ach, which is hooray. So in that sense, ha'ach, ha'ach, as used, seems to be not just mocking, which is how I understood it earlier, and it still can be, which is ha ha, like I got the better of you, ha ha, but hooray, hooray, in the sense of I am victorious over you. And they say that as describing what they should be ashamed of, that sense of seeking with joy to torment or to destroy. Here's the other quote that's worthy of unpacking a little, and that is, what do the righteous say in contrast to what the wicked say? The wicked say hooray, hooray for their victories. They are the arrogant. The righteous say Yigdal Elohim, which I translate here as God is great. Now again, it's just 2 words, Yigdal and Elohim. Let me show you how many different ways that gets translated, though of course they're quite similar. So Steinsaltz, may God be magnified, JPS, extolled by God. Benjamin Siegel, God be exalted. Martin Cohen, God be great. But as we know from the perfect, this is the perfect tense. That's either future or present. It can either be God be great or God is great. And I chose today to translate it as Yigdal Elohim, God is great. And I do in part as a, yesterday we talked about Christianity. And today what came to mind all the more, and this is a last minute rewriting from God be magnified, which sounds like the Kaddish, Yid Kadal v'Yid Kadash, may God's name be magnified. To God is great is that when the Muzanin calls everybody to prayer, and if you've had the privilege in Jerusalem, elsewhere in Israel, to hear the Muzanin calling people to prayer, what the Muzanin chants primarily is Allahu Akbar, God, He is great. So here, what do the righteous say? Yigdal Elohim, God is great. And in that sense, I like that there's a resonance to how this psalm, yesterday we talked about how the psalm would be a sacred text for both Christians and Jews, and how each would find ways to understand the context for verses. In this case, Yigdal Elohim, God is great, will have an echo moving forward to that other monotheistic religion, that of Islam. A closing word that this short psalm evokes for me, and that is the question, what does the psalmist really want? Does the psalmist really think that God is going to intervene and bring about a miracle? When the psalmist says, God save me, Adonai help me, make haste, is he literally asking for an intervention? Which raises for me the question, what is the nature of psalms, or more specifically, what is the nature of prayer? For this short psalm is a short prayer. And what is prayer? And that's part of the power of a psalm versus simply a poem. Here the audience is God, which is the nature of the psalms. It's a conversation with God, a short poem for God that comes out of an immediate moment, even if we don't know that moment. My own understanding of prayer and the nature of prayer, I've mentioned before, is an exercise of writing a letter to God as the nature of prayer. When we write a letter to God, we do so with a mindset which is not theology. It's a leap of faith in the moment, that there is a caring presence who knows us, who cares about us, that we can express our deepest yearnings to. And so in a moment of crisis, we say out loud, God help me. It's speaking in, and again, different people have a different association with the nature of that listening presence. But what they share in common is that there's a caring presence who knows us. And because God knows us, we are spontaneous in what we express. We are honest and unfiltered because God's not going to tell anybody what we're saying. And our deepest longings can emerge, as in this prayer. And when we express our deepest yearnings, what we gain is clarity as to what our deepest yearnings are. It can provide catharsis by having expressed it, and it can be a call to action. It's not necessarily saying, God, do a miracle, but God, give me the strength to overcome this crisis. Let those who would harm me be ashamed of themselves is a deep emotional expression, not necessarily a request for intervention as such. And more, the recording of a prayer, of a psalm, evokes a memory of when we were in that place where we called on God, and somehow, by our own strength, by the change of the other, things changed. Prayer also serves the purpose to evoke a memory of a former moment of turning to God, which offers hope, wisdom, and reassurance. That's faith. Faith is to be faithful. One last comment, and that is the other hinge. I pointed out in verse 5, the first word, yasisu, let those who are glad, as the middle word. But the turning point of this psalm, the middle verse is verse 4, and here too, there is an ambiguity that's profound. Yashuvu, which again is the word that does not appear in verse 40, in Psalm 40, but here, Yashuvu, let them, literally means return. It's like the word we use at high holidays, teshuvah, to turn back to the path, to repent, to atone. Yashuvu, let them turn, could either be understood physically, in terms of turning on their heels, but akev, which is more, can mean not only a heel, but it can be the aftermath. Let them turn in the aftermath of their shame, meaning let them change their ways. Those who celebrated my downfall as if it had already occurred, let them repent. And so the ambiguity of verse 4 is that one word in terms of what is it that this psalmist seeks. He seeks shuvah. He seeks either them turning physically away from him or turning away from how they had acted in the past. Both are possible. And that's the last thing to say about the power of these poems, is that the nature of poems is a clear message and yet ambiguity. The message is many possibilities simultaneously expressed. Clearly, when one is feeling harassed by those who would shame us, we both want them to go away and we want them to change, and we seesaw which we want more. Here, there is urgency. A short psalm, a short call to God that is represented in terms of make haste by limited number of words. With that as our presentation, I now to open the screen. I always like seeing the number 18 for studying a psalm, a good number of screens. For reactions or thoughts about this psalm, let them turn on their heels in shame. Alex, go ahead. You got to unmute, Alex.
Okay. I love the words heach, heach. I never came across them before.
Yeah.
It sounds like a crow. It sounds like they're crowing. Yeah,
Heach. But, because of the guttural, which we don't have in English, heach. As I say it, and I thank you, Alex, for evoking me to say it, there's also this sense of heach. There's something, again, guttural as visceral.
Mm-hmm.
And, but what the visceral piece is not clear. It's not, if you will, but what is clear is we do have these omnopoetic, back to you being aware of the sound of it, ha'ach, like aha, aha, or hooray, hooray, are expressions that are sounds that are evocative as a sound. And that's embodied in this exclamation of those who are the enemy, who say it with this quality either of delight or of mockery. And earlier, as I say, even the first time I went through this psalm, I translated it as ha ha, which is kind of a mockery sound in our contemporary. But because it's two syllables in Hebrew, ha'ach, ha'ach, that's why a lot of the translators do aha, aha, or in my case, hooray, hooray. Mm-hmm. So a riff on ha'ach. Other reactions? Go ahead, Hal.
I wanted to say something about the placement of this Psalm 70 next to 69. 69, which is very universal and panoramic and even violent, whereas this one is very personal. And notice as I noticed the repetition of the pronouns, me, and you.
Yeah.
The real connection, private connection between the speaker and God.
Thank you for saying that, Hal. There is such a commentary as well, because the rabbis, classic commentators, try to understand the flow of the Psalms and find placement as relevant. And exactly as you're pointing out, Hal, yesterday with Psalm 69, there was a national dimension where you're asking God to bring about, peace in the world. There's this national and even global quality. And as you say, this one's very personal, particularly in verse 6, but as for me. So he talks about them and the righteous, and then he turns to himself in verse 6, va'ani, as for me. And the link is, they say that when he finished, the poet, the speaker, finished Psalm 69, he then had permission to now address himself. Like you're a messenger, you deliver the messenger on behalf of the larger, and then you can say, while I have you for a moment, I have a personal thing to mention to you. So I thank you for evoking that comment, classic comment, of the link between 69 and 70. Other things that this psalm evoked? Anybody? Let me see, I got two screens. So,
if I may just make a quick comment, this is an aside. It's not.
Go ahead.
When we read, going through here in verse 3, those that seek my spirit, and that poetic use of my spirit reminded me, as we were going through, of my grandmother, who would occasionally talk about keeping body and spirit together. And for whatever reason, I don't know why that came up, but she also used that sort of poetic form of that idea. Anyway, that's kind of an aside.
Well, that's a helpful aside, and it allows me to do a little bit of a riff on this reoccurring word of my spirit, in Hebrew, nafshi. We saw yesterday in Psalm 69 that the waters were rising up to his nefesh, and that is, as translated yesterday, up to his neck. That's also how the same word is used within the Bible. Spirit means also life. It's also translated as life, as nefesh is breath. And they who seek my spirit is they who seek my life. But as your mother would say, Richard, there's body and spirit, which is to say, there's an element here of also ambiguity. It can either mean they're seeking to kill me, right, to take my life, or they're seeking to corrupt me. They're seeking to, if you will, taint my spirit. Here we don't know what the nature of the attack is, but what we see in verse 3, let them be ashamed and abashed that seek my spirit, is both and either, my body and my soul, that which defines who I am at my core. And so the word nafshi, which is the word most commonly used in Psalms for soul, is also physicality and, again, core identity values. So thank you for allowing me, Richard, to honor your mom and also to riff a little on this word nafshi, which is the focus here for the psalmist. All right, one last comment if there is, and if not, I'll pull it together. I don't see any hands, so let me pull it together to say that this psalm, even though there's this overlap with Psalm 40, and it's been a while since we studied Psalm 40, and again, I'm just delighted to have this time with each of you, and I want to thank each of you. I started off because it was COVID, and I had wanted to study Psalms for a long time, and it's my last big act as a pulpit rabbi in terms of a focus. But even when I was studying the Zohar, which was my last big project, a 5.5-year project, I was highlighting particularly the Psalms, because Psalms I've always been drawn to. Some of my most important teachers in rabbinical school were lovers of Psalms, and I'd never taken the time to really study them. And what I find evoked today as an example is that Psalms are this distinctive kind of poetry to God, which puts one's own yearnings, again, into very clear relief. One can see very clearly the core of a yearning and the nature of believing in a presence of care, a presence of justice, as we repeatedly see in Psalms, who is there to accompany us in life. And in that sense, Psalms represent both question and yearning and faithfulness to both the past and the hopes for the future. With that, let me invite anybody who has Kaddish to join together. And today I'm going to do it on the Aramaic side to honor our loved ones. Yitkadal, V'yitkadash, Shumei Rabbah,
Amen.
Ba'alma Yikra Kirutei,
B'yamlich Malchutei,
V'chaye
Hon,
V'yomei
Hon,
Uvchaye
V'chol Beit Yisrael,
Ba'agala
Uvizman
Karim
Bimru. Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach Leolam L'mei Omaya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitroman V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei Kusha
Berichu Le'ela Mincha Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechamata Damiran Yoma V'imrame Yehi Shlam
Rabba Min Shemaya V'chaim Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'romav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael V'kol Yosef Tevel V'imru Amen.
So if my many books of commentaries on Psalms, this one is by Art Scroll, which is where I get a lot of the classic Jewish commentators. We finish this book next week. It's Psalms 1 to 72. It's a 2-volume set. And that's to say, the rabbis divide Psalms in the Talmud into 5 books, like the 5 books of Moses. So Psalms are the 5 books of David. And the second book is, I think it's 41 to 72. So next week, as we pick up with Psalms 71, 72, and 73, on Wednesday, we will be celebrating the end of the second book of Psalms. Thank you each for joining today and for each of the days you join. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and a good day. Be well.